Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthy, and today I am very, very honored and excited to be joined two very special space champions, Patrick Chase and Evan Lerner. Patrick Chase was born and raised in Rochester, New York, and has been fascinated with space since reading original Star Trek novels as a young boy. He has a bachelor's of arts in political science from the University of Rochester, with experience in political communications and fieldwork. He studied space and astronomy as a minor in college and has written about the intersection of space and politics since transitioning away from his full-time political work. Our other space champion, Evan Lerner, is an aerospace engineer born and raised in New York City. He was introduced to space and engineering at the Bronx High School of Science, later earning his bachelor's and master's in aerospace engineering from the University of Michigan. I'm incredibly excited to hear about all the work that they're doing in New York City and New York State to try bringing aerospace into the state more and to kind of pipeline everything that's happening. So I'm very, very excited to learn about what inspired them to get into aerospace and what inspired them to co-found Empire Space. So welcome, Patrick and Evan. Thank you so much for taking your time to really inspire the next generation of aerospace leaders.
Well, thank you so much for having us. That was quite the introduction. We are honored to share the space with you. You're doing a lot of great work. We're really inspired by the stuff that you've been able to do at such a young age. And we are very excited to see you come to New York to continue your work and studies at Columbia this fall. So we got into Empire Space not because of our backgrounds. I'm from politics and government. Evan's from aerospace. We're from different parts of the state. I'm from Rochester, which is 6-7 hours outside of the city. He's from Manhattan. But we both share a passion and an awareness for how important space is in our lives right now and how much more important it'll be in the future. There's a really exciting story being written right now with Elon and SpaceX and all the transformation he's been doing in rocket launches. Space tourism, going back to the moon, developments in low Earth orbit, the web just launched. It's a really exciting story, and we share a desire to have New York play a larger role in that story. We have lots of good bones in our space ecosystem here, but we feel that they're not really being maximized, that there's a lot of potential being left on the table there. So we came together and founded Empire Space about 1.5 years ago out of a desire to help New York better reach its potential and become more of a player in this exciting new story of space.
Yeah, thank you. First off, I'm very, very excited to be able to come to New York and to meet you both in person and to kind of witness all the work you're doing to bring New York together in the aerospace industry. And thank you for the introduction of what Empire Space is, and maybe it kind of add on to the inspiration behind really co-founding Empire Space.
So the Empire Space started with an email. I was doing some writing during COVID, just writing on Medium about space and politics, trying to re-engage with something that had been a passion when I was younger, but I hadn't really had time. And now all of a sudden I had all the time. And Evan sent me an email. And so we started going back and forth, started asking interesting questions, who's doing what where? We were aware of some of the big players. And then that led to our first spreadsheet, which led to more spreadsheets. And then after having Zooms, once a week for a couple of months and having, now a full Google Drive of spreadsheets, I'm, like, we should probably put this online. We have a lot we're working with. So then I reached out to a friend who has experience building websites. And that's when empirespace.org was born. And then we realized, wow, there is so much here. And there's so much to be done in terms of better kind of maximizing its capabilities that we decided that forming a nonprofit, we're a 501c3, to be able to kind of officially carry on this work was what we wanted to do. It was important, and it would help both of us kind of achieve our dreams that we have for space here in New York. So yes, that's the lengthy story.
Yeah, and I was looking through your website and I saw all of the data that was collected on all the space activities, the retired astronauts, current astronauts that are located in New York. And I was just mind blown with all that was happening in space because usually when you think of space, you're like, oh, Houston, you think of Florida, you don't really think of New York. So to see that that much is happening is absolutely incredible. And I'm glad you guys are able to kind of collect that data and put it to use. So I'm really excited to see all that will happen with Empire Space, which kind of leads me to my next question of Evan, how do you see Empire Space in 10 years? What is your both visions for the organization?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So I think, we're still sort of in our early stages here. So these projects are, somewhat foundational right now, but we do have that kind of perspective 5, 10 years out. Um, as far as big projects, I think I want to highlight what we've most recently, not necessarily wrapped up, but done a first draft of so far. We have a census, which is essentially a really large database that we put together, as you touched on this, of all of those stakeholders throughout the state. And so in that process, we've identified where the gaps are and sort of what big projects what projects would really help to bridge those gaps and grow the ecosystem here. And so that's where we're targeting, and I think we don't really see these as short-term projects. These are big projects for us. So I guess to touch on a few and how we are hoping that those will create the change that we want to see in this industry, at least in this state. I think the first one of those is focused on connecting. You touched on the surprise at how much activity there was here in New York in space, but I think one of the places where there's the most activity is in space financing. So we see tons of money flowing from New York into the space industry to finance various parts of it. But we don't see a lot of that going into space companies in New York. And so we would like to close that gap and bring that space financing, to space companies, but especially to space startups. And so we see room for some sort of accelerator type project in there that we'd like to focus on and sort of bridge that gap and close the loop, if you will, between financing and companies in the state. And I think to touch on one other project, or area that we really like to improve the state's activity and sort of grow this ecosystem from. That has to do with academics. New York is we have a very strong academic system here, but we don't have necessarily that much true focus in space. And I would say that's probably true across the U.S. But we think there's a lot of room for growth here. We think this growth will be seen, and maybe not in New York if we don't create that change. So we'd like to sort of focus growth in space in New York academics on space, with various kinds of space programming. And we think by doing that, we're also able to create more of a pipeline into this space ecosystem in New York. So I think in those two ways, growing academics and growing sort of that connection between finance and businesses, we would really like to create that change. I think I might have one more thing that I'd like to mention. As far as or maybe two more on the academic side, we also want to. New York is pretty strong right now with diversity programs in academics. We'd like to infuse those into that space programming. We think that's something that's really lacking right now in the space industry, and that's probably a great place for New York to step in and create a change. And then lastly, sorry, this is a bit of a long-winded answer. Lastly, we have some really big ticket projects. As far as like down the road to elevate New York's image on that global space stage and make us not just, a state participating in this, but actually make us a state that people go to and think of when they think of space. So a lot there. Some things that, we can't really flesh out right now, but some really big projects that we have in the works.
Yeah, and I can definitely see the vision for this because as individual corporations, with ideas in New York bubbling, it's kind of hard to make that a reality without other support from other companies that may be in New York and maybe in other states. So to be able to kind of bridge that gap and put people together, I think can be so powerful. And I can definitely see the vision in both the financing side as well as the academics with what you're doing in terms of schools and reaching out to schools and infusing more aerospace education into school systems. It'll be a needed change as the aerospace economy continues to grow. And my next question would be for Patrick, which is these are very large goals, but very important goals. So what type of support will you be needing from aerospace industry, aerospace companies to make your goals a reality?
So the one thing that we need specifically from industry partners, but from every stakeholder, really, engagement, innovation, and collaboration. One of our findings has been that we were surprised by how much was going on in New York because it happens in silos. It happens, it's fragmented or industry specific. It's a big state. Things tend to be regional and kind of cut off here. So people aren't communicating, they're not broadcasting, they're not networking. That's leaving a lot of innovation on the table. So for all stakeholders, it's really, for New York to reach its potential in space, people have to go outside of their comfort zone in a way, but reach out to new partners, reach out to different parts of the state, offer to collaborate, offer to share. That creates innovation, that creates those, those innovation cycles where everyone grows. So I think that's, if we could ask one thing from any partner in the space sector, and I would imagine that's true, for other regions that are trying to kind of up their game in the space sector. There's a lot of other parts of the country, Colorado, Washington, New Mexico, Michigan, Virginia, Georgia, all trying to kind of raise their profile. And across the board, stakeholder engagement is critical. And that also feeds into the community. As projects grow, as the space sector grows, people need to be reaching out to the public. It's very easy for the space community to kind of form these feedback loops where they talk to themselves over and over again about how awesome space is. And it's true, it's fun, space is awesome. But it tends to make that conversation very focused, and it gets too wonky, and then average people tune out. They don't understand what's going on. They don't understand the impact. They don't understand the benefits. They don't understand, the local dynamics. They think it's this far away thing that's not happening in their own backyard. So engage in the community in education, in outreach, and trying to make them feel informed and engaged in what's going on. Just kind of raises the profile, the public acceptance, the public buy-in. So when you do get to big projects down the road or big investments in things that'll be necessary when the space economy kind of really kicks up a gear, when you have a fully fledged, launch environment or development environment in low Earth orbit, there's going to be a much bigger ask of the public in terms of what they want to see out of that dynamic. And so you have to reach out to them. You have to have those conversations. So engagement and then the innovation that collaboration spawns is kind of necessary to reach those higher potentials.
Definitely. You mentioned like two really great points in that, answer that you gave, which is one, individuals and corporations need to put themselves out there and to market themselves and to be open to collaborate. Because I'm always a strong believer, whether it be international cooperation or also just, different companies, we all have a long-term vision that's somewhat aligned to some extent. And it's so important to kind of collaborate in those terms because you can go further together than apart. So definitely agree with that. And also what you were saying about communicating with the general public. I talk with my friends all the time and they don't know half the space careers even exist. When I talk about my interest in space medicine, or I talk about someone who's a chief historian of NASA and they studied history, people are shocked that they can work in the space industry because all they assume is scientists and engineers. But there's like a lot more in terms of just becoming an aerospace engineer in the space industry. And I think it needs to be brought out to light as, citizens and the public start to see its importance of the space industry. So yeah, great points.
No, that's 100% true. And I know this is going to be a tangent a little bit, but having studied the polling, there's a lot of misconceptions the public has about space, and they're positive misconceptions. So no one really, works to change them sometimes, but people have a generally favorable view, but it's not really that personally invested. They don't see a personal connection with space. It's very distant for them. They often think that it costs way more money than it actually does. Which is a really bad misconception to have. So I do think it's critically important in this new era of space where it's much more upfront in people's lives. There is a lot of space for misconception. And so it is important for both individuals and entities to kind of be out there engaging, just showing the reality of space and the power that it has to positively impact society.
Most definitely. And I'm really glad that, space companies like Blue Origin are starting to create foundations like the Club for Future and are focusing on investing in the next generation and outreach efforts and providing grants to like 10, 15 other space companies. So I think it's really great that there's private companies doing that. And this next question is really for the both of you. And, Evan could start us off with what is the most interesting fact or something that you just learned or something that surprised you while you both were organizing and starting Empire Space?
Sure. So mine's going to be, I don't know, I guess a bit of an extension on something I said earlier. And it came out of that census effort that we had where we, documented, research and documented sort of what does exist here and how strong the space industry actually is here. And that had to do with the financial side of that. I think coming into this, we had an expectation that, New York was a finance powerhouse,
Yeah.
financial center of the world, all of that. So we weren't expecting New York to be, at the bottom as far as financing the space industry, but we did not expect it to be, top 5 or anything like that. And it then turns out that New York is actually a top 2 financer of the space industry in the US, generally competing with California. So, at the sort of like the earlier stage investing, like venture capital, angel investing, we come second to California. But at the later stage, investment banks, private equity, we end up being the number 1 financial player in the space industry. That was a huge surprise to us. We did not expect New York to be all the way up there. That, really, I touched on this earlier, but that surprise was also connected to like there being a really big disconnect here, where if we are that active in space financing, why doesn't anyone even think about New York when they think about space? And why isn't there anything here? Or why does there not seem to be anything here, I should say. So that was mine. I'll let Pat answer as well.
Yeah, my surprise stems mostly, and I'm still to this day kind of surprised by just the sheer number of entries that we were able to find in our census. When we started creating, categories for what we wanted to gather, we're like, okay, planetariums would make sense. Started looking at college programs, like we knew of Columbia and their physics program, I did not expect to have more than 60, universities in that database. I think right now we are over 1,100 unique entries throughout the entire database between planetariums, observatories, museums, private entities, the financial entries, all the academic entries, and that's broken out for the different clubs. Like some universities have like a dozen entries because they have all the clubs and the different programs. So 1,100 unique entries is just so much more than I had expected. And it goes to that kind of dichotomy of, wow, there's so much more here than I thought. Why are we not doing more with it? Is something that I still kind of come around. And the coolest unique factor that I didn't really realize was a thing was there are dozens of K through 12 school districts in the state that have planetariums on campus, which is mostly like a New York City thing. So it wasn't something that I was even like aware of growing up. I stumbled across this. I'm like, this is so cool. Like, I wish that my high school had a planetarium. I would have been in there all the time. So finding little gems like that was encouraging. That there's a lot here. There's a lot throughout the state. It's not concentrated in one area. There's a lot to work with as we look to kind of maneuver New York into being a bigger player in space.
Yeah, and to this day, I always go back to your website and I'm just so shocked with like the number of schools there are that are interested and directly for space purposes or STEM purposes and the work that all these companies are doing in space. And now to hear that New York City is like one of the top, or New York State is one of the top financial investors in space companies. And that's just incredible just to hear that. I feel like I haven't fully wrapped my head around how much space activity happens in New York. And it needs to be brought out because New York is not something that I think of when I think of the space industry. So really, thank you for all the work you guys are doing. And clearly this is such an important thing that needs to happen, an important vision you both had when developing Empire Space. And everyone has ideas, but making them into a reality, making them into a organization, an entity, in your case, a nonprofit, it takes a lot of work and commitment, especially when you have another job, a full-time job you're doing. So I'm curious, Evan, could you give us some advice or give students or professionals advice from your own experience of how do you make a thought, an idea you have into a reality?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all those kind words. So I think, there's a lot to be learned here. I do want to highlight this again. We're still pretty early and pretty small. And so, you know, take all of our advice, I would say, with, maybe a grain of salt. But I think for, one of my biggest takeaways is probably persistence. I think we've seen, we've not only have we done what we're doing, but we've also studied a lot of, previous attempts to do similar things in New York and in other states. And we've seen sort of what succeeds for us. And for us, that has been persistence and just sticking to our goals, slogging through, doing, the difficult work, not really giving up, putting in all the time and effort, and just, committing and sticking to everything we wanted to do. It hasn't always been easy. I think we've talked about the census a little bit. That was not supposed to be the project that it turned into. We anticipated that would be a pretty small project. But here we are, we finished it like a year later. So there have been some difficult endeavors. We've walked into some really big meetings that we honestly, didn't know we were setting up for ourselves, but they've turned out really well. So, you just got to sort of stick to it and keep moving. Never really give up. I don't know if Pat has anything he wants to add, but that's my advice.
No, that's my lesson too. When you develop that idea and you realize that that door has cracked open, when I realized that I had that moment here, with Evan, to turn something that had been, a dream into a reality, step there and then just keep stepping one day at a time. You kind of keep your head down, keep what you have in front of you, set those short-term goals, those medium-term, your long-term. Don't lose yourself at one end of the spectrum. You always have to keep things in perspective. You have to keep that openness and that communication. Evan and I talk all the time. We talk very openly. We strive for that consensus. We seek outside input when we acknowledge that we don't know where we're standing. You have to have that humility about you when you're walking down this road for the first time, of knowing the questions that you don't know the answers to, and not just making something up, but seeking out other pools of expertise. So that would be my add-on to that question.
I'm gonna hop back in, add a little more. I second everything Pat just said. I think those are all great points. I think keeping that broad perspective, remembering to sort of take a step back and make sure that your perspective is, you're accounting for as much as you can, and also taking in all the feedback that you can. I think that's really important. And one other thing I also wanted to add is that, I think at the beginning of this project, you would probably be right to say that at least it was a little bit scary for me to start a project like this. And I think Pat alluded to that as well. And so I guess, even when starting something like this does seem scary, you sort of appreciate the importance of it, and you stick to it, and you do it, and you see what comes of it, and you keep moving. So I guess that's sort of saying what I said earlier, but I think it's important just to confront that and get through it.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful advice, with both perseverance and humility. And also what you were mentioning at the end, Evan, about how it's so important to realize that something can be unreachable or unattainable, or something that may seem unrealistic, but just taking that chance or that risk to be like, okay, I'm going to start at least tiny steps and I'm going to persevere through it, I think can be so powerful. And whether it be starting your own company, starting your own startup, but also through your daily life, being able to take those tiny risks to reach a goal you have, a goal that may seem unattainable, is so important, that I'm sure every student can, take to heart.
Very well said.
Yeah, and my next question is, for Patrick, what was your aha moment for getting into the space industry? Both of you are incredibly passionate about aerospace, so I'm curious, Patrick, of what was that aha moment for you to get inspired of the aerospace industry?
So I was hooked on space from a very young age. I was a very avid reader when I was young. Both of my parents encouraged, to read. They didn't care what me and my siblings read. They just wanted us to read. And my dad had a whole bunch of original copies of Gene Roddenberry's first Star Trek novels. So some of the first stuff that I can remember reading as a kid was just book after book of the original Star Trek novels. And that just got me so interested in space and exploration that after that, I started just kind of consuming all the other kind of sci-fi or space. I read Dune so many times over and over again as a kid. I loved that book. Reading, the Apollo mission reports, when YouTube and the internet became a thing, watching videos of launches or browsing, the NASA website for latest updates on missions. So just always a passion, just kind of centered in, I don't know, space always seemed kind of positive and uplifting, and there was always something kind of beckoning to it. There's something kind of very pure to our little planet, in stark relief kind of against the rest of the universe. And so many of the problems that I spend my day job in politics and government focused on, so many of them are thrown into such a different perspective when you kind of realize the immensity of it. And then kind of turning that back when I got older and got into politics, it kind of clicked, just realizing the potential good that studying and exploring space could do for humanity. Not only just in terms of economic or material problems that could be solved or scientific questions that could be answered, but just what I think it would do good for us psychologically, to kind of cross some of these barriers and kind of prove to ourselves that we can do these big things and start something fresh somewhere else. I think that would do a lot of good for a society that I think is still trying to find its way in a very difficult time. So yeah, it started with those original, when I was 5 or 6, just reading about James T. Kirk running around, exploring strange new worlds and wanting to go there with him. And here I am, 30 years later.
Wow. Yeah, and I'm sure every kid can relate with like the movie or the book or the astronaut they saw that really inspired or piqued their curiosity for aerospace. I know for me, it was always those like sci-fi movies and like curiosity of, are there aliens? So definitely, I knew a lot of people can relate with what you were saying, Patrick. I'm so glad you found your way into the aerospace sector to some extent. And it's a part of your life. I appreciate that. And Evan, I know that you're an aerospace engineer and you had a difficult journey kind of getting to where you are today. So could you share a little bit about, did you face any obstacles? And if you did, how were you able to overcome them?
Sure. So I guess I'll talk about two things. I want to talk about, I guess, both myself, but also Empire Space. So I'll answer, for myself first. It ties into Empire Space as well. So, there's a few different threads that got us to founding this company. One of them was that when I'm as you touched on, I'm from New York, the background in the aerospace industry. I was out of the state for a little bit and I wanted to come back. I wanted to come home, and there were not many opportunities at space companies in the state. And so I was struggling to find, a way to stay in this industry and come home. And luckily for me, there ended up being a lot of remote jobs available outside the state. And so I was sort of able to sidestep that problem for a little bit, at least, taking a remote job, being able to work from New York, stay in the industry and everything. But that wasn't necessarily easy to figure out. I, had a very large opportunity from that with how the professional environment has changed recently. And that isn't exactly what I wanted. Ultimately, I really want to be part of this industry from New York, not in a remote capacity, but in a true capacity. So I think that answers the first part. It wasn't that easy to end up where I am, but I sort of figured it out. And that's brought me to founding Empire Space to hopefully create that change, so that I'm able to have those opportunities in New York with everyone else. If you want to stay in the space industry, you're able to work in the space industry from New York, if that's what you want, myself included. So that sort of ties it into Empire Space. And then I think also to speak to maybe obstacles that we faced for Empire Space, obviously what I just touched on, professional opportunities for people to work in this industry in the state, that's a big one. I think more generally though, Empire Space is sort of founded around these obstacles. And I think, I don't know, as far as overcoming obstacles and sort of how we've done that, I think you're able to look at our playbook so far. And I think one of the biggest things, as far as like playbook for overcoming obstacles is first you have to understand them. You have to learn about them, do your research, do your homework, figure out what the problem really is. And then only from there are you able to overcome it. And so that's, what that census was for us. It was, we saw, obviously there was some deficiency in New York in this industry, but without, there weren't any resources that documented that. There was no way for us to really quantify that without doing the homework on our own and coming up with this answer. So that's what we did. We spent a year doing that. We made this whole census, this whole database that documents where these gaps are, what the issues are, where we have strengths, because we do, and sort of coming up with a plan from there, identifying those gaps and how to bridge them. So I think that answers most of that question. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to ask, or if Pat had anything to add.
Yeah, Patrick, you could go ahead, and if you're willing, I would love to hear your response as well.
No, that is kind of tied everything really neatly together, because Evan's right. When we started a year and a half ago, we were much more eager to get into projects, and we wanted to get a lay of the land. And then when we realized just how much work that would be, that was definitely a fork in the road for us as an organization. Like, we decided to, our priority now is information gathering and presenting and formatting, regardless of how long that takes. We were able to take that feedback, shift our course, set a new objective for ourselves, and stuck with it. There were times, I would spend, weeks at a time in a specific spreadsheet, just kind of smashing my head against an Excel spreadsheet, trying to finish it in some of that data harvesting. But we did stick with it. We achieved our goal. We have a much better understanding of the ecosystem as a whole, who's operating where. That has opened so many more doors for us as an organization, because we have this knowledge. We have this ability to network and program off of that knowledge. And if we hadn't done that, if we had short-circuited and tried to jump, we might be, so much further along on one or two specific projects, but we would have lost sight of the playing field that we were operating in.
Yeah. I want to.
Yeah, Evan.
I just wanted to, I guess, to add to that. Sorry to interrupt, Pat. Just want to add to that and sort of say that these starting on that project, as you said, there was a fork there. We had projects that were definitely more exciting to us and that we were more interested in pursuing at the time. But this was the more important path to take, to inform us, to give us the context that we needed before we drove down those paths and potentially went the wrong way. And so that was what we had to do, regardless of whether it was what we most wanted to do. So it's sort of important to make the right decision there, not the decision, or for the path of least resistance, or for what you most want to do. It's what's most important for the organization. Sorry to interrupt, Pat. I think you had more you wanted to say.
No, you're good. You got the plan.
Yeah, and you both had such incredible responses. I can really see the passion you both have for Empire Space from your responses. I think the work it took the past year to be able to even collect all this data, I can imagine that, like Patrick was saying, the hours and hours of just looking at those Excel spreadsheets, like it really did come to fruition. And I can say that because so many companies in New York and outside of New York are going to be able to access this data and really be able to, find those collaborations, find those partnerships, figure out who's in that space where they can collaborate with. And it is just such a powerful piece of data and work that you guys have going on your website. And I cannot wait till it really just reaches everyone in the New York State, because I think it can be so powerful to connecting every single person. And I know next year is going to be very, very exciting for Empire Space. So Patrick, do you want to share what's next year holding for Empire Space?
So now that the kind of bulk data gathering is done, we're still adding new entries. We're still pursuing various, avenues, always trying to find places that we haven't explored yet. But the priority now that we have this database is networking with the stakeholders in it, and beginning to spin up specific projects to identify gaps that we found. So we want to start reaching out to people, having one-on-one Zooms. We've had a couple of town halls and roundtables so far. We want to have more of those group events. We want to have sector-specific events. We want to start having regional events, pretty much introducing people to each other, introducing people to us. Like I mentioned, there's 1,100 different entities in the census. At some point, the goal is to speak with and establish a functional relationship with every single one of them. And then the second part is some of that gap filling. As Evan mentioned, we were founded around obstacles. So when we identify those obstacles, we want to correct them. So minor ones, there are NASA ambassadors in almost every region of the state. There's one region of the state that, according to our research, does not have a NASA ambassador. So finding ways to recruit someone into that role and provide that resource to that community which didn't have it before is kind of our definitional purpose. So when we find these gaps and we find these weaknesses, we then identify programming that we can try to spin up to fill some of those gaps. And eventually the goal is you do enough spinning in enough directions and you get to some of those core issues, the outflow of college graduates, the outflow of financing to other regions of the country. Eventually we can program ourselves into turning some of those flows back into New York, which juices the private sector component. Businesses start hiring, they start innovating in the state. And then once you have that flow going positive instead of negative, once you find the right way to flip that back, you have job creation going, you have businesses locating in the state, and then everything starts to feed on itself. So we're now beginning that networking and collaboration and initial programming phase.
Evan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, not really. That was a perfect answer. I guess I'll just add that it sort of all ties back to that question earlier. Our next year is obviously not going to be everything we do in the next 5 to 10 years, but it's certainly going to be connected. We hope that these projects that we've already identified are sort of our long-term projects, and we'll just feed off them as we continue to grow this state's activity in this industry.
Yeah, I'm really glad there are individuals like you who are trying to find that gap and address that gap so we can move forward and, make New York that space hub we want it to be and to be recognized as a space hub it really is. So, thank you for that. And my last and final question, now that we were able to understand more about your journeys, your passion for space, as well as the work you're doing with Empire Space, this question I asked to all the interviewees or all the individuals who come on the show, and either of you can answer it or both of you can answer it. And it is, what final piece of advice do you have for students regarding their pursuit of a passion in STEM, aerospace, really just any career, something you wish you knew in high school or in college?
So this was the question that I thought about the most prepping for this interview. And I really distilled it down to this. It's, don't get distracted by shiny new objects. Society has gotten very good at just throwing things at us that pull our attention or distract us or kind of cloud the picture. It can be very easy these days for other people's priorities to become your priorities, for people to get lost or unfocused or depressed. It's very easy for the shiny old object of money to kind of tilt people away from their passions. That's something you kind of always have to guard against. The allure of doing something just for the money never ever works out. I have never seen someone in my experience do something just for the money and wind up happier for it. So that would be my advice for people pursuing their passions, is to stay grounded, stay rooted, keep your head down, one day at a time. Don't get distracted by all of the stuff out there that can pull people away from what they really want to be doing.
That's incredible advice. Thank you so much. I know as a student myself, that's something that I will definitely take to heart, because I know it's so easy to be attracted by new things that come at your way, new opportunities, and you just get pulled in a direction. And I know, me and all the other students who are listening will really take that to heart. And I think it's so important to always follow your passion, because it can make you motivated to wake up every morning and do what you love. I always hear when individuals, especially in aerospace, when they talk about their typical day, they're always so excited to talk about their job. And I don't necessarily see that in other careers. And I hope aerospace never changes. And I hope it always is that career that everyone can be like, I just study if there's aliens on Mars. Like, that would be such a cool job to have, right? And I think just having that passion to, just let it, drive your life, and that itch, kind of following that itch you have of curiosity or, excitement, it can be, really just change your life. And that's what got me into space medicine. So I know that, the advice you gave today, as well as the work you both are doing with Empire Space, which clearly is something you both are very passionate about, I know will go very far. So thank you so much for taking your time to talk with me today and to also inspire all students. I'm so excited to meet you both in New York.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us. I'll let Evan wrap up with some final words. I would just pitch the site itself, it's empirespace.org. We are going to have some events coming up in the future. We're planning another town hall probably sometime in the fall. We're looking to start in-person events, happy hours of a sort, also sometime this fall, probably in the city. Other, Zoom town halls or formats. We'll be rolling out a newsletter soon. So that's kind of the stay tuned final message that I have. And again, thank you so much for taking the time and extending the opportunity. It's been a pleasure being able to speak with you.
Yep. Yeah. I'll pretty much just second that. A large part of what we do is growing a community. And so, to everyone watching, we'd love to have you as a part of this community. That's pretty much what Pat said, joining those events, whether they're virtual or in person, if you're able to come, all of that, we're really trying to get everyone involved. So yeah, so please come, stay tuned for what there is. And thank you so much for hosting us. This was great.
Yeah, and all those links of your website and where they can find specific data will all be in the description. So thank you so much for your time today. I had a wonderful time speaking with you both.